My name is Thad Zolkowski, and I'm the Associate Director of the Leon Levy Center, which is funded by the Leon Levy Foundation and a generous grant from Shelby White. Each year we offer 4 residency fellowships of $72,000 each. And this year our fellows are Rebecca Donner, who's working on a biography of her great aunt, a Nazi resistor named Mildred Harnack. Stephen Heyman, who's working on a lost generation and first organic farmer, Louis Bromfield. Samanth Subramanian, who's working on a scientific biography of J.B.S. Haldane. And Jennifer Homans, who's working on George Balanchine. This fall, we received from the Sloan Foundation a grant to support a 5th fellowship of $72,000 for a biography on a figure of science or technology. And finally, we received approval for a 2-year master's program in biography and memoir, and we have the due date for that is April 15th, and we have merit fellowships and on offer, so spread the word about that, please. This evening's speaker, Silvana Paternostro, is the author of In the Land of God and Man, Confronting Our Sexual Culture, which explores gender roles and the effect of government and religion on women's lives in Latin America, and My Colombian War, a journey through the century I left behind, which mixes, country. Oh, sorry, what did I say, century?
I left that one behind.
Yeah, do you like that better? Next book, which mixes memoir with history and reportage to tell the story of Colombia's 40-year-old civil war and uncover the truth about U.S. involvement in the country. She was also associate producer on Che, the Argentine, and Che, Guerrilla, a 2-part movie based on the life of Che Guevara, directed by Steven Soderbergh. Tonight, Paternostro is here to talk about her latest book, Solitude and Company, an oral biography in the tradition of Edie, the subtitle of which conveys the social polyphony of this kind of biography when it's done well. The life of Gabriel García Márquez, told with the help from his friends, family, fans, arguers, fellow pranksters, drunks, and a few respectable souls. The difference between Edie Sedgwick, a minor figure in the Warhol orbit with no particular claim to fame, which is what made her so perversely attractive as a figure of biography, and Gabriel García Márquez is enormous. García Márquez is, of course, the best known of the writers from Latin America whose work overwhelmed the world beginning in the late 1960s. And García Márquez's brilliance is of a magnitude that would seem to defy or render silly attempts at biographic accounts or representation, but in a completely different and more familiar way, the way of genius. Yet that cult of the genius is exactly what Solitude and Company has so much fun overturning while also retreading, as anyone who reads it will discover. Cristóbal Pera, Paternostro's interlocutor tonight, is an editor who has worked closely with many notable authors, Gabriel García Márquez among them. He is the author of the novel La Bahía Suspendida, as well as numerous essays and articles. And I want to mention the book is on sale, care of Books on Call NYC, so please get a copy and Silvana will sign it for you, right?
Of course.
Okay. Please welcome Silvana Paternostro and Cristóbal Pera.
Thank you very much, everybody, for coming here. It's a full house and to celebrate Gabriel García Márquez, Gabo, with this book that I was thinking he would definitely love and he would ever always prefer than a formal biography. It is the way to present him that he would definitely love among his friends and in a conversation as something that Silvana tried to convey in this book and make the reader feel like he is amongst Garcia Márquez's friends drinking rum, mamando gallo, is something that he can explain later the meaning, and working with exaggerations, metaphors, and having fun. You know. So thank you very much, Silvana. And
thank you, Cristóbal.
And the first thing is just remembering how this project came to be, and how it is for me amazing to be here presenting the great edition that Dan Simon and Seven Stories had brought to light with his usual passion.
It's beautiful.
And how this began in Mexico many years ago, when Garcia Márquez was still alive, by the way.
I went to your office in 2011, if I can.
Yes, please. That's what I want to.
Because I think there's an important part of the puzzle missing, and it's that Cristóbal actually was the editor of the book in Spanish, which was the original. The first time the party began with his friends, and
you came to talk about other projects.
Yes. So, first of all, thank you for being here, and
thank you for the
and thank you to Tad and the Levy Center
thank you so
this
much.
Wonderful skylighted room. So, to give you a little bit of background of how this book came about, and also to a little parentheses about being in the Center for Biography, is interesting because the oral history to me is kind of the compendium to the biography and to the memoir that both exist. So in fact, when I started writing or putting together the conversations, and you'll see when you all read the book that it starts with Gabo was not born. You know, most biography starts with X person was born on, and you'll find out why he was not born. And in fact, Gabo became then, and he was made into Gabriel García Márquez, which is kind of the idea of this book. But to tell you how the book came to exist, I was in Mexico around 2011, and I remember perfectly because I had just been few days before to the inauguration of a museum do you remember this part?
You were there?
Yes, I was
forgot.
there.
Yeah. Okay.
So Carlos Slim, who's the richest man in Mexico, gave a gift of a museum to the city of Mexico. And I went to the inauguration party, and I was very taken because in the stage was Carlos Slim giving his gift, the President of Mexico, Felipe Calderón, Baron de Rothschild, Larry King, and Gabo. And quite an interesting ribbon-cutting posse. And what surprised me was that Gabo was extremely present and absent at the same time. And he cut the ribbon, and there were about 2,000 people in the room. And I saw how everybody swarmed to Gabo with such love, with such admiration, adoration, They didn't go to Felipe Calderón to pay respects to the president. They didn't go to thank Mr. Slim for giving them this new gift. They all rushed to Gabo. And it was like I had never seen but I had seen the footage of all these people, fandom, when the John Lennon came to that. So, and I saw it and I said, wow, this is our Latin American John Lennon. And I remembered, I went back in my mind, I had started doing an oral history about 10 years before for Talk magazine. It was going to be a magazine article, 2,000 words, and they wanted one on García Márquez.
Because they thought that he was going to die.
Yes, yes. They had done Fidel, and they, in the very perfect style, he had just been diagnosed with cancer. And I remember getting this phone call from one of the editors there saying, can you do this? I actually spent 3 days as a student in a journalism workshop with García Márquez in Cartagena. He was starting his journalism foundation, which has done incredible things for journalism in Latin America. I think they actually now like you do here, it's like I'm going to read a piece by so-and-so. They've really created this auteur imprint of the reportage that Gabo was so passionate about. I had gone to one of the first workshops the foundation had done, and he was teaching, and I had written about it. So it came out in the Paris Review. Anyway, I'm also from Barranquilla. I'm not only from Barranquilla, I am from Macondo. Macondo is an area in your mind and in your body, and I speak the language, and I'd like to say that García Márquez is Coronel Aureliano Buendía, you know, the liberal who fought 32 wars, fought them against my great-great-grandfather, who was the conservative general. So I have like Macondo in my DNA. I understand the world that he writes about and that he lived in. So when I got this phone call from Talk, and they said, well, you know, because it was kind of Vanity Fair and New Yorker together, well, that was going to be Tina's next magazine, they said, you know, and you can talk to all the presidents, and maybe you can even talk to Fidel Castro, and you can talk to all the Hollywood people. They wanted luminaires. And I said, let me propose something to you. I will talk to people you've never heard about, but they all come out in his books. And so I arrived in Barranquilla with my tape recorder, digital, not digital, analog cassettes. Remember those things? And I called my uncle, who knew what he calls his first and last friends. That's how he refers to them in the last chapter of 100 Years of Solitude. And I started getting those stories. And they
were still alive. That is the
yes.
That is the amazing thing, because the last person they talked to were you.
Yes. In fact, one of the sad things is when I was redoing the bios of the voices from this book, I had to write 12 or 13, and he died.
Yes, yeah. Among them Carmen Balcells.
Yes. Among them Carmen Balcells, yes. Who Cristóbal and I spoke to 2-3 days after Gabo's death, and that's who you'll hear. That when you read the book, remember she was She was speaking with a broken voice. So back to the original tapes, the first wave of interviews. I did my story. I handed it to Talk, but I had the best time. First of all, it was the golden days of journalism. You know, the Talk was owned by Miramax, which was owned by Disney. So I remember I would say, I now need to go to Mexico because that's where he wrote 100 Years of Solitude. And in Barranquilla, you know, and in Bogota, I would find, I mean, there are people who know everything about García Márquez in Colombia. I mean, there's one guy in Barranquilla who has calculated how many nights Gabo slept in Barranquilla.
I believe it.
There, you know.
I believe it.
There. So, but nobody knew who was the two names that García Márquez dedicated 100 Years of Solitude was. Jomi and Maria Luisa.
Mexico.
I knew they were Mexican.
Spanish refugees.
So I said to Talk, and now I have to go to Mexico. And I got my ticket with Disney, Mickey Mouse in the envelope. And I arrived in Mexico, and I talked to Maria Luisa, who was
That's a very important conversation, by the way.
integral because she kind of, I think, gave him a little bit more of assurance that he was ready to write 100 Years of Solitude, because he had tried to write 100 Years of Solitude when he started writing. And only maybe 15, 20 years later does he actually sit down in Mexico City, drops everything, and 18 months it took him to actually write it down. But it's been in his head, I think, forever. I like to say Talk died before Gabo. They closed the magazine.
Never published the article.
And the Paris Review published them. Plimpton knew that I was doing that. He published them in the 50th edition of the Paris Review, and I thought that was it.
Just a selection.
Yeah, that's just a selection. In fact, I had never heard the conversations. And here it's so interesting because it's about oral history, which I think is a beautiful genre, which, you know, it kind of fell on my lap, and now I want to be an advocate for it. I never heard them because Talk was in such a hurry, because Gabo was so sick, according to them, that I would take the interviews, the tapes. At the end of the interview, I would rush to the DHL office, which is like the Latin American FedEx, and they were delivered to a translator, but I had explained to Talk that it couldn't be their normal translator that could understand Spanish, because these were interviews done in a dialect. Barranquilleros speak a very slangy Spanish, and not only is it slangish, it's infused with age and memory. It has to be someone who understood the material. So a wonderful Barranquillero poet, Miguel Falquez, would receive these tapes in Sunnyside, and so there was never a transcript of the Spanish. So I did a 2,000, 3,000 word magazine story. It came out in Paris Review, and that was the end of it.
We go back to Mexico.
We go back to Mexico, Museo Sumaya, I see Gabo, I remember the tapes, and by total chance, I had to go see Mr. Cristóbal Pera, who I did not know, but he was the editor of Penguin Random House in Mexico City, and I had just published a book, my second book about Colombia, and I was adamant of having it translated. So I come in with my Colombian War, convincing Cristóbal to translate and publish my book. No interest. It's like and I don't know why I mentioned García Márquez. His eyes lit up, and it was like we found Gabo connection, and we spent the next 3 hours talking about García Márquez, because also Cristóbal, and you'll fill in where I'm, was in a way, he was in Mexico, and he, if I remember correctly, you would tell me that you would see him.
Yeah.
You would go and
often.
have lunch with him, and these were the days when he was very homebound. There was still talk that he was writing, and little by little, Cristóbal and I Cristóbal, who is from Barcelona, and
From Sevilla, but
was also the editor of his memoirs.
Yeah, I worked when I was in Barcelona. I worked in the distance with him. I didn't know him at the time.
Yes. And it's very interesting because, correct me if I'm wrong, he was going to write a very, it stops like when he leaves Barranquilla and he gets to Paris. So there's from Paris to the end that we don't know how he would have told that story. But the book that he did publish with Cristóbal is the years that he spent from his birth to the time where he was spending time with his first and last friends in Barranquilla. So it's really interesting because there were conversations I was having, characters that you had read about from his perspective. So I came out of that meeting with Cristóbal, not with a translation from my Colombian War, but with a great new project. Let's make an oral history of 100 Years of Solitude. So I had to go back and find those tapes.
Transcribe them.
I transcribed them.
And get new material.
And then we read them together, and it's like, okay, this was a magazine piece. This needs to be given more scope and give it a foundation. And so I went for a second round of interviews, and that's how Cristóbal and I did this book together. Came out in Spanish in 2014, and then Dan Simon of 7 Stories Press said, I want to do it in English, and this is the book in English. So it's a long-winded way of telling you the story of how it came about.
There's so many things to talk about this book, and it's funny because we are in a conversation most of it, the book, is a conversation where voices come and go without interruption, just segmented by the chapters that you put together to give some chronological backbone to the book. But I think that there are some themes that we could explore that you talk about in the book.
Yes, and I guess the way that I thought would be amazing. That's the Empire State. Wow. that after here, the other thing I found out is that more people than I thought had encounters with García Márquez. He was a sociable guy, and he liked being with people, and people came up to him because he was accessible and a star. And so I remember, like, when I was doing the first round of interviews, I would go back to my hotel, and there were people waiting for me in the lobby saying, I want to tell you this story. I have another story. My phone would ring. And so it's like a chain. It's like a chain that but I also found out that there were people that I mean, García Márquez is the master storyteller, and he felt very compelled to tell his own story. And so there were stories that I also found out, I kind of found out that there were other people that had told their story in a certain way. It was kind of had the way García Márquez liked the story. And I thought that was completely understandable, but it would be fun and interesting to tell uncensored stories. So you will find some of those too.
Unfiltered stories.
Unfiltered stories.
You could explain something about mamar gallo, that is an expression that has a difficult translation. And then I would like to talk about some oppositions or binary terms that we could, that are explored in the book in a way, the coast and the center of Colombia, and how Gabo, in this is a coastal book, you know, also about journalism, and how in this biography is very clear how his origins were in journalism. And for some people, this is surprising. The creator of magical realism, someone who supposedly lived in imagination and creation, his roots were in facts. And he always said and repeated mostly at the end of his life that he considered himself a journalist before, more than a fiction writer. So these things about coast.
Yes, he has said
to make it more.
Many times that to write magical realism, you have to be a journalist in Colombia. So, and he worked as a journalist, but he always was writing fiction. He wrote some short stories that were published in El Espectador that were surreal. He wrote Eva está en su gato, Eva is in her cat, which is, so it's very, very surreal. He
mostly columns that where he was trying some literary, but he was writing also.
But he was writing reportage.
Yeah.
I mean, and film reviews. And he was writing, and he was publishing. You know, now they found out that they used to publish a paper. Jaime Abello, who runs his foundation, was telling me that they had, when he was in Barranquilla, they had a little newspaper called Comprimido, compressed.
It was
like he invented Twitter. You know,
like his first creation of a publication. He created like 4 in his life, and he was the first one of the smallest. The
smallest newspaper.
Newspaper, you know, with a very short sentences giving pills, you know.
Yes. But if you ask my personal opinion, I think that Gabo's fiction is more barrier-breaking than his journalism. I also think, and it's in the book, and it's told to me by José Salgar, if you remember, his editor at El Espectador, the newspaper where he was a cub reporter. And José Salgar would say to him, because Gabo would come very unslept, you know, looking very tired, very disheveled, because he was working during the day in the newspaper, which was his main job, his salary, but he would stay up all night writing fiction.
Yes.
Writing fiction. And José Salgar would tell him, tienes que torcerle el cuello al cisne. You must wring the swan's neck.
What meaning
you have to concentrate on journalism
exactly. You have to kill the literary
the flying
yes.
thoughts.
Yeah.
And I think that he actually, you know, I think it's all very intertwined, and lives are very intertwined, and it's why one thing happens to the other. But I think that García Márquez, from what one hears his siblings say, he wanted to write a novel that would be as important as Don Quixote. In fact, as Don Quixote for the Spanish language. In fact, when he met Mercedes, his wife, when they were very young, and she was not so interested, and he said to him, you should marry me because I will one day be a famous writer. And when he arrived in Cartagena, these are just my points. It's not like he sat one day and wrote 100 Years of Solitude like that. He studied very consciously, which I think is the beauty of what he's done is, because yes, you can have talent, but to me, finding out that in the world of Mamar Gallo and of Caribbean, you know, Mañana, that he had the rigor and the discipline to make this work that really catapulted him.
I think he knew that he had to leave Colombia
to do it.
To do it, no doubt about it. First he goes to Europe when he has to leave because of the reportage he wrote about the shipwreck that was a scandal, and the government was going to do something to him, and that first distance that he takes from Colombia is so important for him, but later on, the first thing he does is, after spending some time in Venezuela, is coming to New York. He spent like 6 months in New York City as correspondent for the Cuban, the newly created Cuban press agency, and then he decides that this is not the place where he wants to live. And then
he starts getting threatening
threats.
phone
Yes,
calls.
and there is a big FBI file that Hoover had on him, and of course he was working with a Cuban. So, and he goes back thinking that he might return to Mexico, to Colombia, crossing all the Faulkner territory, as he tells very clearly. And they finally stay in Mexico, but that distance from Colombia was crucial. For
in
him.
fact, I think I
could have never written 100 Years of Solitude in Colombia.
Never. I think that was another one of the currents that I wanted to make sure the reader got. It's the The impetus, the study that went into it, I have a vivid image of a story that Héctor Rojas Erazo, who was a poet and a journalist that worked with him in El Universal in Cartagena. This is before El Espectador. And he said that they would walk up and down, they would work together in the press room. And at night, they would just go up and down talking, trying to figure out how they could write a novel that would put Latin America in the literary map. They knew what the Russians had done, they knew what the French had done, and they really studied. In fact, Rojas Erazo says, and it's been said before, that he loved the Tolstoy phrase, tell the story of your village and you will be universal. But how, in what language do you say it? And I think that's what he was struggling with. He knew he wanted to tell a story. In fact, when he was living in Barranquilla, the first draft, let's say, of 100 Years of Solitude was called La Casa Grande. And if you remember our conversations about what I call the pranksters or the drunks in the title, they would tell stories about how, that bore García, Gabito is arriving to the bar with his manuscript under his arms, and he would tell us what he was writing about, and we thought it was so bad. And it was the first draft of 100 Years, which took him 20 years to write. So it was a conscious decision, but also providence. I think, and it's not that I believe in providence, but he does, and it's a word he uses a lot in his books, La Providencia, and he looks for ways, but there are things that happen that he has no control of. He is sent to Geneva to cover a big meeting in Geneva, and then he trades in his ticket, he goes to Paris, and he starts writing his columns. But then, because of the censorship, El Espectador gets shut down, and he's stuck in Paris. So he can't write journalism anymore, and he has no money because his only money was the checks that they were sending him from Bogota, Colombia to Paris before PayPal. Very complicated. So he
goes to Rome
to study film, which is interesting, and he was always very interested in filmmaking.
Yeah.
He starts writing. He writes. No one writes to the colonel in Paris, and then one of his best friends. Because this is the other thing about, if there are two lessons, I think, for me that I learned from doing all this work, which my intent was not to write his biography, although I think it's a story of Gabo in all his contradictions. There's all his sides. I think you take it. I lost my train of thought. Where was I, Cristóbal?
Yeah, the lesson. 2 lessons.
2 lessons. The discipline that he had, and that he surrounded himself and had the best friends, the importance of friendship.
Yeah.
And actually, it brings it all together because, and that's why I like calling it Solitude and Company, because a writer requires both. And
Yeah.
that brings in discipline and everything. But it's really interesting you mentioned the film school, because the title comes from one of the people from Bogota that knew him, told him that after he wrote 100 Years of Solitude, and he went from really being a struggling writer to being a famous, rich man, and because the only thing, there was some relationship he had with film that was very interesting. He started a film company with Fernando Restrepo, and they called it Solitude and Company. So I thought it was
Then,
a nice little.
His elder son became a filmmaker, which is
And now we know that they're
a very interesting.
making 100 Years of Solitude as a
Yeah.
Netflix series, which is really interesting because, and this is a story I was never able to prove, but he had said, and Carmen did say, of course, when 100 Years of Solitude came out, it shook the world. It became a huge bestseller, and Hollywood knocked on his door. And there is a story I heard, but I tried to get Francis Ford Coppola to verify it, but I wasn't able to. But there is, Francis Ford Coppola really wanted to make 100 Years of Solitude when it came out. And, offered him, 7 figures, which in those days was a lot of money. And he, although he had now the financial success of 100 Years of Solitude, still it's hard to say no to taking, and he said no. He said he couldn't envision his characters being portrayed. But maybe it's also because he also had this relationship with film that is unfulfilled. But now they are the family has sold the rights to 100 Years of Solitude, and it will be made into a Netflix series.
I think that probably the effect of Roma by Cuarón has something to do, and how to demonstrate how their commitment is to the fact that it will be in Spanish, that can be maybe a series, not a.
It is going to be a series.
It's going to be a series, so they can develop and not just simplify. And the fact that the son is going to be a producer,
Yes.
all this gives them the opportunity to say yes now, and I think they are right.
Yes.
But I wanted to, because we are going to begin the questions that
Q&A.
is the most important thing. Before that, I wanted to ask you the last question, because I've wondered sometimes how reading García Márquez, and then writing about him, then having the amazing chance to meet him and being his editor of his last books and work directly with him changed my life. And it's obvious, it has changed my life in many, many, many respects. And I think, and I've seen people whose lives have been changed just reading him. No, they didn't have to meet him. I've met people in Mexico from UK who live in Mexico because they read one day 100 Years of Solitude and they wanted to. So in that regard, I think that he has changed lives of many people. No? And I wanted to ask you, how has he changed your life? No?
He's changed many people's life. In fact, there is a Dutch guy who, after he read 100 Years of Solitude, moved to Aracataca and changed his name to Tim Buendia. I'm still called Silvana Paternostro, but being so close to him and always wanting to be a storyteller, I think that what I get from Gabo is, and I hear him saying this when I was sitting next to him in the workshop, is find a really good story, tell it in the best way possible. And that is kind of my mantra. And he did it better than most. So I feel privileged to have had that opportunity and that. You know, I don't know if you remember, but Carmen Barcel's, who was very torn when she spoke to us about Gabo, but she also, I don't think, lost her sense of humor, I don't know what to call it, but she said to me, and there will be a Gabo religion. There will be a Gabismo.
Gabomania. In the future, no?
In the future. Yeah. So that's a good one to follow, because I think...
Please, let's open to your questions, okay?
Yes, good afternoon, and thank you so much for this very interesting Gabo today. You already linked García Márquez with Twitter. Having known him closer than all of us here, what do you think he might have thought of fake news vis-a-vis magic realism? And whether there would have been a possible outcome?
It's a good question, in fact. And I will introduce something very briefly. I'm working in the English language edition of a book that we published recently. It's a selection of his journalistic writings that I did, and I began when he was alive to do. The title, in fact, I have here. This is
the question. He wants
the question is what would he think about fake news and Twitter, García Márquez? This is El Escándalo del Siglo, and it gathers 50 journalistic pieces from García Márquez, and this is the book. These are the galleys. The book is going to come out in Knopf in May, and. The title of this
that's the
selection
Chocó Chronicle.
Is El Escándalo del Siglo, comes from a reportage that he...
From Chocó.
No, that he wrote while he was in Rome, in that time in Europe. And look at the title, El Escándalo, the scandal of the century, and is about the mysterious disappearance of a Roman girl, 20-something, that appeared dead in the shore of a beach near Rome. And he wrote 13 installments. It's like a noir, and at the same time, it's like a La Dolce Vita, because the elites, the political elites are, and all the subject about fake news and about the yellow press is there, because he is talking about how some journalists are making up stories about this, and we decided to put the title to the book because it brings both things, the journalistic headline and the exaggeration that tends to literature. The scandal of the century, and it's about the death of a Roman woman in the, so, but I don't think he would like Twitter so much. He needed more space.
I don't know. I think that he was such a modern mind, you know, when I mean, he wrote 100 Years of Solitude on a typewriter. In fact, they just discovered a new manuscript in Mexico City. This is one thing with García Márquez. I don't know if you remember the character in De Amor y Otros Demonios, the girl who's died and her hair keeps growing, because I feel like with Gabo, it's like it keeps growing, But he was a modern man. I remember the moment the computer came, he
had one of the first Apple.
He had one of the first Apple
Apples.
computers.
Yeah, he liked it.
I think he would have had a Twitter account.
Maybe. Yes.
The myth becoming legend. With a personality as large as Gabo's and his fame and the number of friends, what sort of filters did you use to try to choose the stories, and did you try to verify any of them, or was that an issue?
Yes, and you'll find out that both versions are in one of the main things I did was, there are obvious moments in his life that I wanted to include because they were important, like where he was born, and where he... But I found out very early on that he had constructed, not constructed, but he had his own official story, and they're incorporated. But what I did is I added, and because I kind of grew very parallel to the people that he was in touch with in Barranquilla, which is the coast, which is a way of living and a way of thinking, and then in Bogota. And I followed his trajectory, but also what was interesting to me was to show him as a human being. And in Colombia, it was Gabo, omnipresent and in a pedestal. And in fact, I took a lesson that he taught me, because he did that with Simón Bolívar when he wrote El General en su laberinto, the general in his labyrinth. He said in that workshop, I wanted to write about him because I wanted to make him human. And that's what I wanted to do with García Márquez. So I went to all those people that told me stories that made him human.
Yeah, but it's true that there are contradictory versions, because since it's an oral history, it is, if you had to put notes to everything, that there are exaggerations, people who lie blatantly or
like he did.
Yeah, and then there is the famous episode about the black eye that Vargas Llosa gave him, and all the speculations that it's very difficult.
When are we going to know the truth of the?
Yes, please.
Not only was he a human person in his inner, he was also very political.
Very interesting. Very good point.
Yes. And we go into that.
If he hadn't left Colombia, he would have been assassinated, in my own,
Yes. Well.
own personal view, because even 100 Years of Solitude deals with all the political obscenities of the national company, and it is an expose
Yes.
of what goes on
Yes.
in our national life, imposed by the influences of the outside.
Yeah.
And at that time it was mostly
Yeah,
the United
I think it's very clear that
Yes.
he's a political
Yes.
man, and there is a chapter about power and how he always tried to be close to power.
But he was a mediator, a political mediator. a man who tried to get all the sides in Colombia to sit down at the table and talk about peace. He was, you know, sometimes, I mean, there are moments where, you know, now that Colombia is going through the peace process, etc., I wish he were around because he sat in all of the peace accords before.
He was even a mediator
absolutely.
with Bill Clinton and Styron about the embargo in Cuba, and
Yes.
Clinton
There
approached him, and
yes.
he liked that.
Yes. You
role.
can read about
Yes.
it in this.
This is addressed to both of you and also because you were Christians, right? What do you think of claims that his earlier, the English editions of his earlier work are better than his later works because the earlier translator, Gregory Ramasa, was
Oh, wow. Yeah, I would say that the translation of 100 Years of Solitude is a masterpiece. There is no doubt about it. And no, that's something that he said. No, he himself.
Yes.
He
And
himself
Gregory
said-
Rabasa is one of the voices of the book. I interviewed him,
Yeah,
and he's
there. But
he's almost like García Márquez in the sense he translated almost in a delirium state because he was really a translator of Portuguese.
But
and he
English
had done
Grossman is
Rayuela.
also a very good translator of his works. The thing is that the first one and 100 Years of Solitude is like a black hole. It's gonna suck all the attention, and it's the fact that Rabasa is attached to the masterpiece is gonna make anything else looks in another light, you know.
the other works translated by him are Home of the Patriarch, No One Lives in the Colonel.
Yes. I should also point out that it is Grossman who translated Love in the Time of Cholera, 6 of his books, translated the book from the Spanish to the English. And it's quite amazing and beautiful to see, to put it both together and to see how she comes up with.
Solution. Yes.
I was curious to know, the question for both of you, did you have a chance to talk or somebody let know, García Márquez, that you were writing this book, that we were interviewing friends or people?
I'm sure, but
You never
do I-
contacted him? No.
no.
You were telling you were doing this book?
Well, when we met in 2011, you were still going to lunch,
No,
didn't you
I'm
mention
talking.
it?
I'm talking. No, yes. I'm talking about the original project when you began to write the article for talk. That's
Well,
what-
one of the things about oral history is that you don't talk to the person you're writing about. So I was not interested in interviewing him.
No, but I mean, when you were studying about this book, your latest book, did anyone told me so-and-so is writing about you?
Yeah, the family knew.
Yeah, the
because
family knew because-
I told the family I would
Yes.
visit them once a month, at least, and they knew. But they had also known before about a more formal biography written by a British Gerald Martin, and he even got the galley proofs before it was published, and so that's he liked to know what was written about him. That's for sure.
For sure.
I'm sorry. Well, doesn't matter. Yeah, you go 1 second.
What kind of films did you make, and were any of them successful?
That's a good question. Yeah. Okay. So go ahead.
What type of films?
Arendira was made into a wonderful film.
Wonderful.
Really Pavas.
Yes. Beautiful.
Yes.
I saw a play, off play in Avignon, in a factory with a swimming pool of Arendira.
I cannot believe it.
Ah,
And, you know, the pool, the bleachers, looking at the pool, the actors were naked, but you couldn't see
Where was this?
The outskirts of Avignon, southern France.
Wow.
Yeah.
What
And,
year?
Here must have been
80s?
80s.
80s.
Anyway, I was teaching global studies, Latin America was one of the first things, and I had mostly Spanish-speaking, original Spanish-speaking students who were in supposedly a slow class. It was hard to get them interested, so I started reading them Herrera. And what did you know? His father had a video store and brought in the movie.
Oh, how lovely.
They saw the movie as
How
well as they were fascinated by it. And I picked that story because it seemed to me, Latin America come alive.
Yeah,
Beautiful
it's also almost a Greek tragedy.
Yes.
Erendira, that has that statue.
Yes.
But so going to your question, I think he was never successful as he tried, and in Mexico he wrote not many but several scripts. One of them even with Carlos Fuentes, El Gallo de Oro, I think, and. But those films never made it big, and I think he would have loved to have. But then he had a son that made it into a wonderful filmmaker, Rodrigo García. He's in Los Angeles, and he's an amazing filmmaker. So that's he was proud of that.
Yeah, it's interesting that he did authorize the translation of the film of 100 years, but he authorized some films based on
Yes.
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 And,
Yes.
It was his company that produced them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
It was his own company.
Yes.
30 years ago.
Yeah.
Mr. Jerry Carlson, who is a film expert, God. Well, you can tell us about the.
No, but he'd like just to say, among his circle of friends that he
Yes.
made in Rome,
Yes.
they remained his friends all
Yes.
of life when he studied film there. And
Guillermo
they were
Angulo.
founders of the film school based in San Antonio de los Baños.
Yes,
Yeah,
he started a
I didn't
film
mention
school in
that. That
Cuba.
is very important. I mean,
Before
he founded this amazing school of film school in Cuba, and it still exists with a center for Ibero-American cinema.
The foundation is the other foundation.
Yes,
Foundation for
he
the
has one
American
for
Cinema.
journalism and one for film. So these are his two.
And I would mention something else that is very interesting. The same as he did some workshops, and she was lucky enough to go to one of them for journalism. He did workshops in Cuba about screenwriting, but it was broader than screenwriting. It was how to tell a story. And he, and some people there, and I've been there, and I've been with they transcribed his classes. They were for maybe 25 students from all over Latin America or Spain, and many famous filmmakers there attended those workshops. And he gave the rights to the foundation of these books that were cómo se cuenta un cuento, how to tell a story. And then there was another continuation. There are classes on how to tell a story. They
That
are
was his
wonderful,
obsession.
and it's a project that it would be amazing to bring into English. I think that would be, I mean, to have a book about García Márquez master classes on how to tell a story would be amazing.
If I can recommend
Yeah.
one.
Oh, yeah.
I can
Definitely. I know.
recommend One of the films that Gabo was particularly fond of is the film he made with his very close Cuban friend Tomas Gutierrez Alea. It's Letters from the Park.
Oh,
Yes.
yeah.
And
Yes.
it's a bit derived from the story world of Love in the Time of Cholera, and it actually was shown here many years ago on PBS. They liked it so much.
Yeah.
And it's a film that everybody
Yes.
was very happy with.
Look at this. It's very interesting because there is some trasvase, how it was some communication between movies and stories sometimes. And here in the articles, there's one of them. He did this movie, María de mi Corazón. Do you know that movie? Yeah, but that movie springs from an idea he had. And he did this screenwriting. And then he made that screenwriting into a short story. And he incorporated that into 12 Cuentos Peregrinos, 12, I don't remember how. It is, well, it's an amazing story. One of these obsessions about this woman who is in the road.
Well, in fact, he leaves New York for Mexico because his friend Alvaro Mutis is living there, is working in advertising.
Yeah. He tells him that there is work as...
And he says, I'll come here because I can get you work. And he ends up in a circle of filmmakers. Yeah. In fact, Luis Buñuel was there. Yeah. So he has a very vast context and relationship with the Spanish and Latin American film.
You wanted to ask him, yes. Yes.
I just wanted to ask you had published his memoir, and I'm just wondering, did that parallel any of the later conversation that came about, based that from his mind?
In what sense?
I'm saying, did what came later in the oral history parallel the memoir that actually...
Okay. Well, it's different because in his memoirs, he decides for the first time to put his narrative skills to his own life, and that was a big challenge for him. And that coincided with his illness in Los Angeles. He wrote most of it in Los Angeles, and thinking that maybe it would be the last book he would write. So that is very different from this biography of him with like a collage of other people's conversation. I don't know if that's...
But
Did it infiltrate in any way?
No.
His memory.
Oh. Well, I mention something because now I remember when he decided to write his memoirs, he returned to his journalistic skills. And I know very well, and he told me that he began calling people he hadn't seen in years. And he would ask them, okay, I remember this like this, but tell me, how did it happen? And he found out that many things that he remembered were not at all as he remembered them, or he had another version. So he became a sleuth of his own life, which was beautiful, you know.
Yes, and it coincides. I get the assignment at the same time, and the memoir comes out, and when I read it, it's very interesting for me. Before I was even doing the book, because I had talked to the same people that he had gone to look for. And one of my favorite stories is because for example, there's a character that Cristóbal was very angry with because he was always criticizing Gabo, remember?
Yes. Well, he was sour. He was sour of his success. And you could tell, and it was good too, but it was too much. I mean, the guy was really...
And then I find Gabo's way how he remembers him. And he remembers that this guy gave him a keychain of a rabbit's paw, because they were friends. And Gabo says in his memoir, if Kike would only know that it's still an amulet for me. But the sour guy that is one of the most never mentioned the rabbit's paw.
I think it's an interesting story.
Of course. No, to
But all of our lives would have been
Oh,
of course.
absolutely.
You know, the people we
course.
Yeah. And then just an anecdote. As an editor of his memoirs, I was in Barcelona and I was talking on the phone with him. He would send faxes and with proofs, etc. I felt overwhelmed. I mean, I'm going to edit García Márquez. What can you do with? So I took my job more as a fact checker than anything else, you know. And I still remember his joy when I found, and I finished with this. When I found in a very important statement that he does, and he has repeated that he says that. When he read the Metamorphoses by Kafka's Metamorphoses, it changed his whole conception of literature or of what he could write about. No? Pedro Páramo and Kafka were really the two authors that made him think about this so-called magical realism later. But then he said, I read in the book, in the memoirs, in the manuscript, I read the Metamorphoses in this wonderful translation by Jorge Luis Borges. And I had recently made an edition of Borges, and I had come to an interview with someone who, with Borges, where he said, I never translated the Metamorphoses. I translated, it's true, I translated because he knew German, a short story, El Médico Rural, the rural doctor, and the editor put it at the end, I mean, added Metamorphosis, but put me as the translator of the whole thing to sell the book. So that was one of many, but I told him this, and he was so happy that they were not going to catch him in this.
In this lie.
Okay, let's correct it. So he was always worried about facts, you know.
Yeah.
So
if I just, it's so much fun to read Cristóbal's the memoir, and to go back to Solitude and Company, to 100 Years of Solitude, after you, because it really goes back to explain how what he said, that everything he writes is based on truth. Yeah. And you can, it comes alive when you put the two together. Yeah. So.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.